Throughout the 20th century, no propaganda machinery matched the manipulative power of the Third Reich. Its dominance was not based solely on military force or repression, but on the creation of narratives designed to control collective perception. The regime transformed pseudoscience, the media, and history into tools of indoctrination, from the myth of the perfect Aryan to the figure of the charismatic Hitler. Under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda turned lies into a political instrument. Cinema, radio, and education spread fictions that legitimized territorial expansion, anti-Semitism, and obedience to the Führer. Institutions such as the Ministry of Propaganda and the Institute of Racial Hygiene gave a scientific appearance to falsehood. After 1945, many of those myths persisted: human soap, the supposed Jewish origin of Hitler, the escape to South America, or the miracle weapons of the Reich. Decades later, Soviet archives, Nazi documents, and forensic research proved their falsehood. They were propagandistic constructions intended to perpetuate fear and myth. This documentary exposes 15 of those deceptions, analyzing how they arose, spread, and were finally dismantled by historical evidence. The perfect Aryan, an image fabricated from propaganda. During the years prior to his rise to power, Hitler showed a constant interest in the racial theme. In his speeches and texts, he promoted the belief that the so-called Germanic race was superior and should be kept without mixtures. He described this group as a racial elite, destined to impose itself over the rest. For him, the ideal prototype of that race was a tall person, with light hair and blue eyes. When he acceded to power, those ideas became official doctrine of the regime and were disseminated through public media, radio stations, cinematographic productions, school systems, and written publications. German authorities began to apply that vision with the participation of scientific sectors of the country that claimed that human beings could be improved if the offspring of those who did not fit that model was restricted. From 1933, doctors practicing in Germany received authorization to apply surgical procedures that prevented procreation in certain sectors of the population. The measures targeted especially the Romani people, a minority group that numbered about 30,000 people within German territory. They also included individuals with mental disabilities, people born with blindness or deafness, and patients with psychiatric disorders. In addition, approximately 500 Afro-German children were included in that plan, descendants of local mothers and African soldiers who were part of the Allied forces that occupied the Rhineland after the Great War. The idea of race was used by Hitler to describe Jews not as a religious group, but as a biologically harmful collectivity. He accused them of feeding off other races and weakening them from within. Upon the establishment of the regime, teachers aligned with Nazism began to introduce the concept of racial science in schools. They examined skulls, measured noses, and noted the pigmentation of hair and iris on school records with the aim of detecting who, according to them, belonged to the authentic Germanic community. Students identified as Romani or Jewish were singled out in front of the rest of the classroom during that process. On the 24th of February of 1920, the German Workers' Party held its first mass event in the city of Munich. On that occasion, Adolf Hitler presented a list of 25 points that defined the political bases of the movement. The document established as essential principles the maintenance of an ethnically homogeneous nation, the subordination of groups considered inferior, and the exclusion of Jews from any form of citizenship. In point number 4, it was categorically stated that no person of Jewish origin could be part of the national body. On the 18th of July of 1925, the first volume of the book that Hitler wrote while imprisoned was published after his failed attempt to seize power. In that work, he put in writing his opinions on racial themes. According to his vision, history was a competition between human groups for territorial dominance. He planned to extend the borders eastward, conquer those lands, and subject the Slavic peoples to German control. He considered Jews as a particular threat, capable of corrupting from within the racial integrity of the country. He proposed their expulsion as a necessary measure. In mid-1933, the new regime introduced reproductive control measures directed at groups considered undesirable. Under that framework, thousands of people with disabilities were sterilized, including hundreds of Afro-German children born after the occupation of the Rhineland, as well as Romani people and psychiatric patients. In the academic and scientific sphere of Nazi Germany, there were disagreements about the concept of Aryan race. Several specialists in anthropology, genetics, and biology considered that term to lack scientific validity. School texts on racial studies made clear that the word Aryan came from the linguistic field, not the biological one. After debates between academics and authorities, the use of the term was eliminated from official documents starting in 1935. The specialists maintained that speaking of an Aryan race made no sense within the scientific parameters handled at that time. The image of the blonde Aryan with clear eyes was maintained as a decorative or symbolic element, useful for propaganda, but without weight in the real classifications applied by the state. Within the regime, racial studies contemplated three distinct approaches: the idea of people linked to territory, language, and culture, the concept of race as an observable physical category, and population genetic analysis. Each one operated with different criteria. Although the borders between them were not fixed, specialists made efforts to differentiate them. In fact, it was common to accept that speaking a language did not define racial belonging. Authors who treated the theme with rigor rejected that there was a direct correspondence between physical appearance and biological origin. The most influential experts, such as H.F.K. Gunther, recognized that within the German people there were mixtures of racial components such as the Nordic, the Alpine, the Mediterranean, and others. Even when studying the Jews, they classified them as the result of diverse combinations, without recognizing a single genetic composition. That same complexity made many Germans fear that an excessive exaltation of the Nordic model would lead to despising those who did not respond to that appearance. Tensions also arose between disciplines such as anthropology and genetics, especially when it became clear that external image did not guarantee a pure genetic inheritance. Geneticists warned that there was no way to purify a group through reproductive control. One could have a Nordic appearance and, at the same time, show behaviors associated with other racial profiles. Therefore, the visible physical trait did not reveal the deep genetic structure of the individual. As scientific research advanced, the regime began to set aside the theories of racial anthropology and lean toward more technical models. By the late 30s, geneticists gained ground within key institutions of the state apparatus. That shift coincided with a turn toward a more practical management of the state. The promotion of a nationalist science, such as Aryan physics or Germanized mathematics, was losing strength from 1936. In its place, priority was given to applied disciplines oriented toward concrete objectives. In summary, although the image of the ideal Aryan was used in propaganda campaigns, it was not an excluding norm in official decisions. Racial identification was based on broader parameters, related to ancestry and not solely to external appearance. The rumor of the lost testicle and its use as political mockery. During the war, British troops popularized a mocking song in which it was insinuated that the Nazi leader had only one testicle. The melody was catchy and the lyrics varied frequently, although in some versions it was said that the supposed remaining testicle had ended up as a trophy in the Albert Hall. However, that musical mockery had no proven medical basis. Several stories have been proposed to explain that rumor. One of them assures that Hitler would have lost a testicle on the front during the combat of 1916 in the Somme due to shrapnel. Another version places the supposed injury many years earlier in his childhood after an accident with a goat. But none of these claims has firm documentary support. The truth is that the impact he suffered during the battle was in the leg and not in the genital area. Furthermore, the version of the supposed lost testicle comes from a confession that presumably a priest would have heard from a German doctor years later, which does not constitute solid proof. The only professional who examined Hitler during his youth, the Dr. Eduard Bloch, who later fled to the United States, stated under interrogation that the physical condition of the future dictator was completely normal. Despite this, interest in the intimate aspects of Hitler has not ceased to resurface. Decades later, it was said that the Soviets had performed an autopsy on the corpse found in Berlin and that it recorded the absence of one testicle, although that version has not been taken seriously by researchers. In 2015, a German researcher had access to medical reports written in the Landsberg prison, where Hitler was imprisoned after the failed Munich coup in 1923. According to those notes, the inmate was in good physical condition but presented a right cryptorchidism, that is, he had the right testicle undescended. The rumour also gained strength when a British tabloid published a story based on the late testimony of a supposed colleague of Hitler's doctor who would have witnessed the wound during the war. In that account, Hitler himself asked the doctor if he could have children after the incident. However, no official document supports it, and biographers such as Ian Kershaw have indicated that the only confirmed wound was in the left thigh. The authors of the book Hitler's Last Day, Minute by Minute, published in 2015, mentioned the possibility that he had suffered two anomalies, an undescended testicle and an uncommon genital condition. However, they clarified that these hypotheses do not constitute conclusive evidence nor allow definitive statements about his anatomy. The real origin of the song dates back to the beginning of the world conflict. Its intention was to ridicule the Nazi regime, and ridiculing Hitler himself by insinuating that he was missing a testicle was a way to detract from his authority and courage. The lyrics, with a childish tone, sought to suggest that neither he nor his circle were complete men, indirectly questioning the idea of a supposed racial perfection. The claim that Hitler had only one testicle is not supported by conclusive medical evidence. Most versions come from rumors, propaganda, and unreliable sources, often disseminated for purposes of mockery or symbolic delegitimization. The story of human soap, between rumors and weak evidence. During the last months of the war, stories began to circulate among prisoners about the supposed manufacture of soap with human fat in German facilities. Those rumors spread quickly and reached the ears of the Allies, who collected them in reports and testimonies. After the fall of the Third Reich, several statements mentioned the Danzig Anatomical Institute as the place where that type of soap would have been produced. Over time, that episode became known as the Spanner case. The initial versions pointed to Professor Rudolf Spanner, doctor and director of the institute, as responsible for the experiments. Witnesses claimed that in the dissection rooms, human remains had been processed to obtain fat, and that with it, small quantities of soap had been made. During the first post-war trials, the information was presented as proof of the criminal character of the Nazi regime. However, over the years, researchers verified that the evidence was scarce and inconsistent. Subsequent investigations showed that the material found in Danzig came from the usual procedures of anatomical preservation. The chemical analysis of the recovered samples revealed components typical of the agents used in medical practices of the time. There was no evidence of systematic production or an industrial process intended to manufacture soap with human bodies. The supposed manufacturing corresponded more to a limited experimental use, linked to the anatomical work of the institute. Professor Spanner was not a member of the Nazi Party and had continued his scientific work during the war years under difficult conditions. His team worked with cadavers that arrived from various hospitals and nearby camps, used for teaching practices. The records do not show official orders authorizing the use of human fat to make soap, nor documents linking those activities to racial policy or extermination programs. The small quantities of substance that appeared after the Soviet occupation of the area corresponded to residues from the skeleton preparation processes used by the institute. The myth of human soap gained notoriety when it was linked to the product labeled RIF. The initials were erroneously interpreted as rein judisches Fett, that is, pure Jewish fat. In reality, the designation came from Reichsstelle für industrielle Fettversorgung, the Reich Office for Industrial Fat Supply. RIF soap was an ordinary commercial product, manufactured with synthetic and vegetable ingredients, with no connection whatsoever to human remains. During the Nuremberg trials, the prosecution briefly mentioned the Danzig case, based on testimonies from former institute students and reports from Polish authorities. The statement spoke of experiments, but did not demonstrate large-scale manufacturing. None of the major regime leaders was formally charged for that fact. Over the years, the Polish government itself reviewed the case and concluded that there was not enough evidence to support the claim of industrial production of soap from human bodies. The most recent historical analysis agrees that the confusion arose in part from the mixture of real facts and war rumors. The anatomical practice of the Danzig Institute, the chemical findings, and incomplete testimonies were combined into a narrative that soon spread as an extreme example of barbarity. Allied propaganda took advantage of the story to illustrate the enemy's brutality, and the rumor solidified in collective memory before being verified. Modern academic studies, including those by Neander, Montague, and Kulka, examined documents, samples, and photographs from the time. All agree that the initial reports were exaggerated and that there was no plant dedicated to transforming cadavers into soap. The substance found in the institute was a residue used in cleaning skeletons for medical exhibits. It was not a product intended for consumption or distributed outside the laboratory. The persistence of the myth is explained by the combination of partial testimonies, linguistic confusions, and the emotional impact produced by the magnitude of Nazi crimes. Although literary and journalistic references have been found that repeated the story without documentary basis, historical research considers it a legend arisen in wartime. Forensic reports, chemical analyses, and archive reviews demonstrate that there was no industrial production of human soap under the Third Reich. The known cases were isolated episodes linked to medical practice, not to the extermination machinery. The false legend of the Jewish Hitler, a rumor without evidence or documents. Hans Frank was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer starting in 1928. In 1939, he received the position of Governor-General in occupied Poland, and he remained in that function until the end of the war. During that period, the Germans under his command executed a systematic elimination policy against Polish priests, doctors, jurists, professors, and writers. In Nuremberg, he was sentenced to hanging for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Before his execution, he wrote his memoirs under the title Im Angesicht der Galgen, which were published in 1953. There he related that Hitler received a blackmail threat from his nephew William Patrick Hitler. As a result of that, the Führer himself tasked Frank with investigating possible family scandals, and it was then when, according to him, he discovered that Hitler's paternal grandmother had worked in Graz in the house of a Jewish family named Frankenberger, and that the son she had out of wedlock, Alois Schicklgruber, might have been a descendant of that household. That version circulated widely, but historians have pointed out that for 1836, the year of Alois's birth, there were no Jews registered as legal residents in the city of Graz. One of the most cited was Nikolaus von Preradovic, who maintained that no Jew lived there before 1856. From that statement, the generalized idea was established that Frank's story was false. However, other records show that a small community was already established in Graz before the mid-19th century. Official documents from 1824, 1826, and 1830, cited by the Austrian Ministry of the Interior, confirm that several Jewish families had legal authorization to live there. The Austrian state itself mentioned, in 1860, the prior presence of a small settled community in that city. Letters from local authorities in Graz have also been located that, in early 1837, requested that the right of residence be respected for certain Israelite families. All of that indicates that the Jewish presence in Graz during the years when Maria Anna Schicklgruber became pregnant cannot be entirely ruled out. Even so, no document links that woman to any man named Frankenberger, much less is there proof that her son had that surname. In 1930, Hitler ordered the Reich Genealogical Office to verify his lineage. The report delivered by the official body ruled out the existence of Jewish ancestors in his paternal or maternal line. The study included birth records, marriage certificates, and other parish registers. That investigation found no link to Israelite families in any branch of the Chancellor's family tree. Frank claimed to have found letters between Hitler's grandmother and the supposed Jewish family, where child support payments for the boy were discussed, but he never showed those documents, nor did anyone else see them, nor were they found after the fall of the regime. In subsequent interviews, several members of the Hitler family denied knowing that story. Among them, Paula Hitler, the Führer's sister, stated that she had no knowledge of any rumor about Semitic ancestry. In 1943, the doctor Eduard Bloch, who treated Hitler's mother, told American interrogators that he never heard anything suggesting a Jewish origin in the family. Despite the numerous versions that emerged after the war, no researcher has presented material evidence supporting the existence of family ties between Hitler and people of Jewish origin. The only thing that can be confirmed is that his father, Alois, was born out of wedlock, and that the identity of his biological progenitor was never clarified. The only source that sustains that theory is the written confession of Hans Frank, prepared after he had been sentenced to death and without providing documents. His statement was published years later and reproduced by media without independent verification. From there, the hypothesis kept repeating itself without new supporting elements. The Nuremberg court records show that Frank changed his testimony on several occasions and that at different times he justified his version as part of a moral duty. However, his words were contradictory, and at no time did he offer physical proof of what he claimed to have discovered. The theory about a possible Jewish grandfather of Hitler has been used repeatedly as propaganda material, but was never corroborated by contemporary sources, family records, or state documents. The official genealogy of the Nazi leader, validated by his own administration, ruled out that possibility after a direct search of family background. The contradiction of Nazi racism in the face of its global alliances. In the 1930s, German foreign policy already showed clear signs of collaboration with regimes that shared strategic interests with the Reich. From Berlin's perspective, the Japanese government became a key partner in Asia, not due to ethnic affinity, but because of its geopolitical usefulness and its anti-communist stance. In 1936, the Anti-Comintern Pact formally sealed this alliance, linking Japan and Germany against Soviet influence, while Italy would join the agreement 1 year later. Although Nazi ideology proclaimed the superiority of the Aryan, the regime's hierarchs did not apply that criterion uniformly when evaluating their external alliances. In concrete terms, relations between Tokyo and Berlin intensified through diplomatic contacts, intelligence exchange, and military cooperation. These actions, driven by practical interests, contradicted the idea of absolute racial exclusion. Adolf Hitler and other high commands justified this link by claiming that Japan had proven its worth as a civilizing power, capable of confronting communism and defending its regional hegemony, which granted it an exceptional position within the Nazi scheme of racial hierarchies. In parallel, the Third Reich explored communication channels with Arab nationalist sectors. During the Second World War, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, met with Hitler in Berlin and expressed his support for the regime's anti-Jewish policies. The Palestinian leader not only sought political backing, but also participated in radio propaganda broadcast from Germany to the Middle East, with messages aimed at promoting anti-Semitism and weakening the British presence in the region. In exchange, Berlin encouraged speeches that linked the Arab nationalist cause with the fight against international Judaism. Simultaneously, figures of National Socialism such as Heinrich Himmler showed some interest in Indian movements opposing British rule. One of the most notorious cases was that of the leader Subhas Chandra Bose, who, after breaking with Gandhi over his peaceful methods, sought support from the Axis. Bose arrived in Berlin in 1941 and was received with diplomatic gestures. There he promoted the creation of an Indian Legion composed of prisoners of war captured in North Africa, which collaborated with the Axis forces in the hope of freeing India from British control. At no time did these alliances imply a redefinition of Nazi racial doctrine. The official ideology maintained that the German people represented the core of European civilization, but accepted tactical relations with other groups considered inferior if that strengthened the interests of the Reich. In official speeches, the need to preserve the purity of the Germanic people was insisted upon, but certain collaborations were tolerated if the benefits outweighed the ideological risks. The regime's diplomatic and military structures operated on that logic, as demonstrated by the signed agreements and the joint missions carried out during the war. The internal hierarchies of the Third Reich never included Arabs, Japanese, or Indians in the Germanization projects or in the Aryan social models, but they did use them strategically in war contexts. Nazi propaganda even softened its tone in eastern regions to avoid alienating useful allies. In India, German radio broadcasts omitted references to National Socialist racism and emphasized the common British enemy. Something similar occurred in the relationship with Japan, where Berlin avoided imposing concepts of racial supremacy in its diplomatic communications. Nazi racial policy did not consist of indiscriminate hatred toward everything non-German. The criterion of exclusion was applied strictly to Jews, with systematic extermination policies, and to a lesser degree to Slavs, Gypsies, and Africans. However, in other contexts, the ideology was modulated according to the political and military interests of the moment. Collaboration with Asian powers and Arab or Indian movements demonstrated that the regime prioritized the expansion and security of the Reich above total coherence in its racial discourse. International eugenics, the global experiment that inspired the Third Reich. Much before Hitler came to power, the concept of eugenics was already circulating in universities and parliaments of the United States, Great Britain, and several Nordic countries. From the beginning of the 20th century, American doctors, politicians, and jurists debated how to apply biological principles to the improvement of the population. In 1907, the state of Indiana enacted the world's first forced sterilization law, authorizing public institutions to surgically intervene in people considered incapable of reproducing without risk to social health. 3 years later, California approved a similar norm that would soon become the most cited model. In the 1920s, more than 30 American states already had legislation of that type, backed by the Supreme Court in the Buck v. Bell case of 1927, which legally endorsed the sterilization of Carrie Buck under the argument that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, figures like Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin, promoted the idea that society should encourage the reproduction of the fit and limit that of the unfit. These ideas were institutionalized in the Eugenics Education Society of London and in international congresses that included delegations from the United States, Germany, Scandinavia, and Canada. In the Nordic countries, the movement spread rapidly. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark adopted sterilization laws decades before the rise of Nazism. All of them shared the same principle of biological control of inheritance as a means to reduce poverty and mental illnesses. In that global context, German medicine observed foreign experiences with attention. From 1910, German scientific publications analyzed American sterilization programs, especially those of California, which were considered an example of practical application. Several German doctors participated in international conferences on eugenics held in New York and London, where birth statistics, inheritance studies, and marital selection methods were discussed. Private American foundations, such as the Carnegie Institution and the Rockefeller Foundation, financed genetic research in Germany long before 1933, including projects at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics. When the Nazi Party took power, eugenic ideas were already part of the accepted scientific discourse in much of the West. On the 14th of July of 1933, the German government promulgated the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases, which authorized the compulsory sterilization of people diagnosed with epilepsy, congenital blindness, schizophrenia, or mental retardation. That measure did not arise from an ideological vacuum. The legal text itself cited studies and statistics elaborated in the United States. In internal reports of the German Ministry of the Interior, the California norms were explicitly mentioned as the main reference. Regime jurists, such as Ernst Rudin, declared that American legislation had demonstrated the social and medical viability of mass sterilization. Between 1934 and 1939, more than 300,000 people were subjected to forced interventions in Germany under the new legal framework. The Reich authorities considered those procedures a tool of national hygiene, continuing with the scientific rhetoric that decades earlier had become popular in North America. The difference was the scale and radicality with which the German state applied those policies, integrating them into a totalitarian structure that combined biology, social control, and political repression. The links between German and American scientists remained active even after 1933. Articles published in journals of both countries compared results and surgical methods. Some American experts, such as Harry Laughlin, director of the Eugenics Record Office, publicly praised the efficiency of the German system and received distinctions from the Nazi regime for their contribution to racial improvement. In turn, German researchers sent reports to American universities on the application of sterilization laws and the organization of hereditary health courts. These communications show that the relationship was one of mutual influence, not a unilateral invention. The idea of improving the human species through the selection of who could or could not reproduce was at that time a mainstream current in many industrialized countries. Germany transformed it into state policy, but the seed came from the international eugenics movement that had germinated decades earlier. References to British and American models appear in multiple official documents of the Third Reich, confirming that the intellectual base of the Nazi program relied on foreign theories, adopted and taken to the extreme by a regime that turned biology into an instrument of social control. Eugenics was not a German creation, but a transnational doctrine that combined medicine, statistics, and social morality. The United States and the United Kingdom were the first to establish compulsory sterilization laws, and Germany took those precedents to build its own legal system of exclusion. The Third Reich did not invent the practice, but took it to its most brutal limit by incorporating it into the state machinery and applying it on a national scale under the argument of the biological purity of the German people. The supposed Nazi hatred of Christians between alliances and silences. In 1933, Germany had a population close to 60 million people. The vast majority belonged to Christian denominations, with approximately 20 million Catholics and nearly 40 million Protestants. Only a minority of less than 1% was Jewish. The major churches were not facing a crisis of faith or a rupture with their communities. The arrival of the new regime was not seen as a religious threat. Both in the Catholic and Protestant cases, the stances toward the new government were not guided solely by faith. Among the factors that shaped their attitude were rejection of the previous political system, fear of communism, nationalism, resentment toward foreign powers after the defeat in the Great War, and admiration for the order promised by National Socialism. In that context, millions of Christians interpreted as legitimate the phrase from the NSDAP program that proclaimed its support for a positive Christianity, as long as it did not threaten the state or offend the moral sentiments of the German race. That formula excluded what was Jewish and materialistic, but did not deny traditional religion. Among the Protestants, the dominant institution was the German Evangelical Church, a union of 28 regional churches. In the preceding years within this structure, the movement known as German Christians had emerged, which defended a form of Christianity compatible with the nationalist and racial ideals of the new power. After Hitler's rise, that group sought to unify all churches into a Reich Church, subjected to a racialized interpretation of the gospel. In response to that current, the so-called Confessing Church was formed. Its manifesto, the Barmen Declaration, affirmed that the loyalty of the faithful should be directed exclusively to God and the Scriptures, not to any temporal leader. Despite that declaration of principles, both supporters of Nazism and its opponents, and even those who avoided any conflict, remained under the same ecclesiastical umbrella. That situation generated an internal struggle known as the Church Struggle, which did not consist of direct resistance against the state, but of a confrontation between different visions within Protestantism. Among the figures who openly opposed the regime stood out Dietrich Bonhoeffer, executed for participating in a conspiracy against Hitler, and Martin Niemöller, imprisoned for 7 years in concentration camps for his criticisms of the government. Nevertheless, their example did not represent the majority position. The majority of religious leaders who were part of the Confessing Church prioritized avoiding internal divisions or friction with the authorities rather than challenging the established power. The religious hierarchies avoided direct confrontation. In both denominations, there were criticisms of racial ideology, and efforts emerged to protect baptized members who were considered non-Aryan according to the regime's laws. However, throughout that period, there were no public condemnations against anti-Semitism, nor were open actions promoted against state violence. Even so, individual cases of Christians who acted to help the persecuted were recorded, as occurred with the White Rose Resistance Network or with the initiatives of Hermann Maas. What Nazi censorship really did with books. The book burning was one of the most symbolic acts of the regime's first year. The actions organized in May of 1933 had a propagandistic character linked to the proclamation of a new cultural era. Although impactful, these burnings were not repeated on a massive scale in the following years. The burning was accompanied by speeches that presented the Third Reich as a spiritual renewal. The authorities did not decree the systematic destruction of all works of foreign Jewish or socialist origin, but they did impose exclusion criteria that remained under the supervision of the Reichsministerium für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda. In 1937, the Handbuch der Reichskulturkammer established the official structure that governed all cultural activities in the country. Within that network, the Reichsschrifttumskammer was in charge of controlling what was printed, published and distributed. Writers, editors, translators, illustrators and booksellers had to be registered with this entity to practice legally. The regulations indicated that those who lacked political reliability, those considered hostile to the nationalist worldview, or those belonging to groups declared incompatible with the German spirit, were excluded. Despite these restrictions, an important part of the literary corpus in the German language remained available during the regime. National classics, religious literature, technical manuals, works by non-persecuted authors, and publications without political content continued to circulate without obstacles. Some foreign books, after passing censorship, could also be edited or imported. The objective of the cultural apparatus was not to eliminate all previous texts, but to shape a controlled environment where only what was permitted could be read, taught, or disseminated. The authors removed from the shelves were not automatically forgotten. Many emigrated and continued writing in exile. Public libraries were purged, but not destroyed. In the internal records of the Reichsschrifttumskammer, the names of the banned were noted, along with the reasons justifying the prohibition. The criterion was not uniform. Some writers were partially accepted, while others were definitively outside the circuit. The bureaucratic apparatus was meticulous but selective. The forbidden party of Nazism, homosexual persecution and power in Hitler's Germany. During the movement's early years, some prominent SA members maintained affectionate relationships with other men, and although that reality was known, no immediate measures were taken. Ernst Röhm, Chief of Staff, was one of the most notorious cases, and his situation was tolerated for a time due to his closeness to Hitler. However, in June of 1934, that margin closed abruptly when Röhm and several leaders were executed during the Night of the Long Knives. From then on, the regime systematically hardened its policy toward male homosexuality, both within its ranks and in civil society. After the purge, the government used the Röhm case as proof that homosexuality was incompatible with loyalty to the state. The Ministry of the Interior, the Gestapo and the SS developed new guidelines to identify and arrest those considered degenerates. In 1935, paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code was reformed, which previously punished only explicit sexual acts between men, and was extended to include any conduct with erotic intent between males, such as looks, gestures, or affectionate letters. With this legal expansion, the police could arrest tens of thousands of people without the need for physical evidence. The judicial system interpreted the law so broadly that a suspicion or a denunciation was enough to initiate a conviction. The statistics compiled after 1935 show the scale of the repression. Between 1933 and 1945, more than 100,000 men were investigated for alleged homosexual activities. Approximately 50,000 were sentenced by the courts, and thousands ended up in concentration camps. The inmates classified under that category wore a pink triangle as a distinctive mark and occupied the lowest level within the prisoner hierarchy. They suffered isolation, forced labor, and frequent aggressions by guards and other inmates. In some cases, they were subjected to surgical castrations or sterilizations under coercion. Mortality in that group was high due to the violent treatment and the inhuman conditions of the camps. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS and one of the main drivers of the persecution, considered that homosexuality put the survival of the nation at risk. In his speeches, he stated that the bond between men should be directed toward obedience and sacrifice for the German people, not toward personal relationships of an affective nature. He saw homosexuals as a threat to military discipline and to the reproduction of the race. That is why he ordered the creation of a special department within the Gestapo in charge of identifying and registering them. The resulting files served to feed a database of profiles considered dangerous to the national community. The party authorities insisted that homosexuality was not just a moral issue, but a matter of the health of the state. Propagandists presented it as a social infection that could spread in the army or in youth organizations. Any sign of closeness between young males aroused suspicions, and surveillance extended to the Hitler Youth and the SS. Internal reports warned that personal friendships between soldiers could weaken the authority of the command and affect military efficiency. This idea was reinforced with propaganda, which disseminated images of a disciplined, virile youth centered on duty. In that context, military courts applied harsher penalties to party members than to civilians. Hitler himself declared that soldiers should be an example of morality before the people. The same act that in civilian life could lead to brief imprisonment in the ranks of the SA or the SS implied years in prison or transfer to camps. The official doctrine considered that male purity should serve the project of strengthening the Aryan race and ensuring birth rates. Any deviation from that model was presented as treason to the community. The medical apparatus supported the repression with the language of science. Psychiatrists and regime doctors classified homosexuals into two groups: the incorrigible, who had to be isolated or sterilized, and the reformable, for whom experimental therapy methods were tested. Among them were shock treatments, hypnosis, and hormone therapy. These practices were applied in state-linked psychiatric institutions and also in concentration camps, where doctors like Karl Wernert conducted trials without consent. The official objective was to reinsert the individual as a useful member of German society, although in practice these procedures ended with the death of many patients. The rumor that the party was made up of homosexuals arose long before the war, used by its political opponents to discredit the SA and its leaders. After 1934, the regime itself recycled that accusation to build its moralizing discourse. Propaganda presented the executions of the Night of the Long Knives as a necessary cleansing to preserve the honor of the nation. Hitler used the episode to consolidate his authority and show that no personal behavior was above the interest of the state. The Röhm case became a symbol of how public morality could be instrumentalized to reinforce political control. As the war progressed, the repression maintained the same intensity. The Ministry of Justice ordered that prisoners accused of homosexuality could not be released early or mobilized to the front. In the camps, the survivors of that category were very few. After 1945, the penalties of paragraph 175 remained in force in West Germany until decades later, which prevented many of them from being recognized as victims of Nazism. The myth of a party full of homosexuals served to hide a very different reality, a state that used that accusation as a weapon to control, punish, and eliminate those who did not fit into its ideal of purity and obedience. Nazi Blitzkrieg, the supposed lightning war that never existed as doctrine. During the years prior to the outbreak of the European conflict, German military doctrine retained traditional structures and did not include any official strategy called Blitzkrieg. The term did not appear in manuals, training, or documents of the Reichswehr or the Heer. Its origin comes from the foreign press, which after the campaign against Poland used the expression lightning war to describe the speed of the German advances. This denomination was a British journalistic interpretation, not a German military formulation. There is no evidence that the German General Staff ever defined Blitzkrieg as a formal doctrine or guiding principle of war. High command officers such as Franz Halder or Alfred Jodl continued to think in traditional terms of attrition and maneuver. Even Heinz Guderian, who was later linked to the idea of mobile warfare, never used the expression Blitzkrieg in his operational writings. His theories on the use of armored vehicles did not include references to a supposed secret doctrine or a complete strategy based on surprise and lightning attack. The tactical decisions made in campaigns like that of France in 1940 responded more to specific circumstances and improvised adjustments than to the application of a uniform plan. The success on the Western Front, interpreted by foreign observers as part of a supposed Blitzkrieg, was in reality the result of combined factors and not of an already established theoretical principle. The panzer units did not act in a completely autonomous manner, as a modern doctrine would indicate. In many cases, their movements had to be coordinated with motorized infantry divisions that followed at a great distance. Furthermore, the logistics of the German army in 1940 still depended largely on horse-drawn transport. The idea of a mechanized and fast war machine in all its components was a later construction. Not even the attack in the Ardennes was the product of a doctrinal formula. The decision to send armored vehicles through that rugged terrain was made in part by the commander of Army Group A, Gerd von Rundstedt, and his chief of staff, Erich von Manstein, who proposed a bold turn against the original OKH plan. The General Staff had proposed a frontal attack through Belgium, similar to the advance of 1914, but Manstein's proposal sought to concentrate effort on a weak point, using speed to encircle the enemy. The execution of that plan relied on the use of radio in tanks, which allowed for more effective coordination between mobile units. But that innovation was not exclusive to the German army, and in fact other powers were already working on mobile communications on the battlefield. What made the operation work was the chaos in Allied decisions, delays in the French reaction, and the scant preparation of British commanders for a war of movement. The narrative of the lightning attack as something premeditated later served as a propagandistic resource to present the Wehrmacht as invincible. However, within the army itself, there was no doctrinal school that taught Blitzkrieg as an official method. Military teaching continued to be oriented toward prolonged wars, with emphasis on artillery and logistical lines. After the 1940 campaign, many historians began to use the term as if it were a label applicable to all German actions. But subsequent operations, such as the invasion of the Soviet Union, demonstrated that there was no clear continuity in the methods employed. In Operation Barbarossa, supply problems, immense distances and Soviet resistance nullified any attempt to repeat what happened in France. In fact, German commanders could not maintain the same speed or coordination. The armored units advanced so far that they were left without support, and the infantry soldiers could not keep up the pace. The offensive quickly lost momentum, and the Germans had to return to conventional strategies of encirclement, siege, and attrition. The term Blitzkrieg was adopted in retrospect by writers and propagandists both inside and outside Germany. Joseph Goebbels used it in speeches to exalt the regime's early victories, although in his diaries he never mentioned that it was a real doctrine. The Third Reich's press used the concept to reinforce the image of military efficiency, but the OKW manuals did not include it as a strategic basis. In post-war German academic circles, authors like Karl-Heinz Frieser demystified that construction and clarified that it was a media simplification rather than a solid doctrinal framework. During the 1950s, some military theorists in the United States again employed the concept as a model to follow. In the midst of the Cold War, Pentagon analysts recovered the term Blitzkrieg to refer to high-mobility operations in future conflicts. That use also had nothing to do with German practice during the Second World War, but rather was an instrumental rereading to design rapid strategies in modern contexts. What began as a newspaper label ended up converted into a historiographical category, often used without nuances or references to the real context of the operational decisions made between 1939 and 1941. The concept of Blitzkrieg, more than a planned strategy, was a label constructed afterward to explain the impact of certain military campaigns. Its use was opportune for propaganda, but it lacked a clear doctrinal basis within the German army itself. The stab in the back, how a national lie was born. After 4 years of fighting on the Western Front, the High Command of the Imperial Army knew that the situation was unsustainable. During the summer of 1918, German forces were outnumbered in men, supplies and morale compared to the Allies, who had received constant reinforcements from American troops. Despite General Erich Ludendorff's attempts to reorganize the offensive in March, the lines broke. When news arrived in September that Bulgaria had surrendered, panic spread in Berlin. Military reports spoke of extreme exhaustion in the trenches, desertions, and lack of resources to withstand another winter. Faced with that panorama, Ludendorff and Marshal Paul von Hindenburg informed Kaiser Wilhelm II that continuing the conflict was unfeasible. On the 29th of September, the Supreme Command formally asked the imperial government to request an immediate armistice. In a political maneuver that sought to evade responsibility, Ludendorff recommended handing power to a civilian cabinet led by Prince Maximilian of Baden. With this, it was intended that the signing of the capitulation would fall on the politicians, while the generals preserved their image before public opinion. On the 3rd of October of 1918, the new government was formed. A few days later, United States President Woodrow Wilson received the German note requesting the cessation of fire. However, in the streets of the Reich, reality remained chaotic. Protests multiplied, sailors mutinied, and factories reduced their activity. While the army retreated, radical sectors began to organize councils of soldiers and workers. In November, the monarchy fell, the Kaiser fled to the Netherlands, and the Republic was proclaimed. On the 11th of November of 1918, the armistice was signed in a train car in Compiègne. Although the military commands knew that defeat was inevitable, an alternative narrative soon emerged. The idea was promoted by Hindenburg himself in 1919 when he appeared before the Parliamentary Investigation Committee of the Reichstag. In his intervention, he affirmed that the front had not been defeated by weapons, but that the lack of support in the rear and internal decomposition had weakened resistance. This version focused on accusing socialists, trade unionists, and communist agitators of undermining the army's morale from within. That narrative was called the legend of the stab in the back, and it had rapid dissemination among conservative, nationalist, and ex-combatant sectors. The association of defeat with civilian elements, especially left-wing parties and the Jewish community, served to exonerate the military commands and to undermine the legitimacy of the new Republican regime. Organizations such as the Stahlhelm, the Deutsche Vaterlandspartei, or some monarchist newspapers repeated the story, insisting that the war had been lost in Berlin, not on the battlefields. Hitler incorporated the idea of internal betrayal as the axis of his political discourse. In Mein Kampf, he blamed the Jews and Marxists for the collapse of the front and described the armistice as a humiliation imposed by an anti-national elite. This narrative took deep root in a Germany devastated by inflation, unemployment, and the trauma of war, and became a pillar of National Socialist propaganda. Starting in 1923 in the Leipzig trials, testimonies from former officers, veterans, and military analysts supported the version that the army was never defeated on the front. Some even claimed that, had they resisted a few more weeks, Germany would have negotiated under better conditions. However, the High Command documents proved otherwise. There were daily reports confirming logistical collapse, lack of ammunition, and the impossibility of resisting Allied attacks in several key sectors of the front. During the Weimar Republic, this narrative was systematically used to discredit democratic governments. The rallies of nationalist formations, such as the NSDAP, presented Republican leaders as traitors responsible for handing the homeland over to the enemy. In schools, public events, and media aligned with nationalism, the version of the stab in the back replaced the documented reality of military collapse. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, that legend became part of the official state narrative. The commemorations of the 11th of November, instead of remembering the signing of the armistice, became acts of denunciation against internal betrayal. In official speeches, the blame for the Treaty of Versailles was attributed to those who had accepted defeat, not to those who had directed the war. Figures like Hindenburg were publicly rehabilitated, and those who defended a different interpretation of the facts were persecuted. The stab-in-the-back myth not only served as justification for annulling the democratic system, but also as a basis for ideological persecution. Jews, socialists, and opponents were identified as responsible for the fall of the empire. This narrative prepared the ground for repressive laws, political purges, and a political culture centered on obedience and resentment. The false story of an internal betrayal allowed the Nazi regime to build its legitimacy on a lie carefully repeated for more than a decade. Did they want to conquer the world, the true objective of the Reich? During the Second World War, the Allies spread the idea that Hitler planned to dominate and enslave all of humanity. This claim simplified the true territorial and racial objectives of the Nazi regime, which never included global conquest. The real planning of German expansionism was documented in an internal project called Generalplan Ost, prepared by the Reich Central Security Office under the direction of Heinrich Himmler. This document, classified as secret, established guidelines for reconfiguring Eastern Europe in accordance with the racial criteria of National Socialism. The plan had been conceived by specialists in demography, economics and territorial planning linked to the SS. Its execution was projected in progressive stages over 30 years, although it was to be kept outside public knowledge. The content of the program focused on ensuring German dominance over Poland, the Baltic countries, Belarus, Ukraine, and certain areas of Western Russia. There, it was planned to expel, exterminate, or Germanize tens of millions of people considered racially inferior. According to the drafts prepared between 1941 and 1942, those responsible for the Generalplan Ost contemplated displacing more than 30 million Slavs to remote regions of the East. In their place, Himmler foresaw settling German peasants, selected for their biological value and their ability to maintain racial purity. This colonization would be carried out through a combination of forced deportations, ethnic cleansing, and agrarian restructuring. The Slavic peoples who remained would be subjected to forced labor and reduced to a condition of serfs without rights. Himmler trusted that the colonization of the East would guarantee Germany's survival for centuries. In his private speeches, he affirmed that this region would be the heart of the new European order. He was convinced that only through the complete occupation of those territories could the future of the German people be guaranteed. In his written instructions, he insisted that the new settlers had to be physically robust, disciplined, and loyal to the Führer. Colonization should not repeat the mistakes of the past, such as racial mixing or religious tolerance. The Generalplan Ost was not an improvised strategy, but a state policy backed by detailed studies. The content of the plan was reviewed several times by Richard Wetzel and Konrad Meyer, responsible for its technical drafting. Demographic estimates, agricultural production calculations, and land distribution schemes were elaborated with precision. It was even proposed to create a central office in charge of coordinating population transfers and supervising the progress of German settlement. Although the war prevented its full application, some of its provisions were put into practice in areas such as Zamość, where deportations, expropriations, and forced resettlements were carried out. Local resistance and lack of resources limited its scope, but the initial orders were clear. In various regions of Poland and Ukraine, the SS carried out ethnic cleansing operations inspired by the content of the plan. Thousands of villages were expelled and replaced by Volksdeutsche settlers from the Baltic and other European areas. Official documents show that the main goal of the regime was to radically transform the ethnic map of Eastern Europe. The idea of enslaving the entire world never appears in the strategic texts of the Nazi government. The myth arose as an Allied propaganda tool to simplify a much more localized program, although brutal. The obsession of the Third Reich was to dominate the East, not to extend its dominion on a planetary scale. The impossible escape of Hitler, corpse, fire, and propaganda. At the end of April of 1945, while Berlin fell under the Soviet advance, Adolf Hitler remained enclosed in the Führerbunker, accompanied by some collaborators and his partner Eva Braun. On the 30th of April at midday, after marrying Braun hours earlier, Hitler went to his private room and took his own life with a shot. Braun accompanied him by taking poison. The bodies were doused with gasoline and set on fire by direct orders from the Führer himself, according to those present. Several of the witnesses who were there, such as Heinz Linger and Otto Günscher, confirmed these details in subsequent interrogations. The sequence of events and the testimony agree that the death was executed with precision, and the remains were partially charred next to the bunker entrance. Soviet troops, upon entering the sector, collected bone and dental fragments among the charred remains. These elements were preserved by the NKVD security services. A part of the skull and a jaw, along with dental prostheses, were transferred to Moscow and classified as evidence. In May of 1945, Soviet services interrogated members of Hitler's inner circle, such as personal assistant Linger and Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger. The information gathered allowed the reconstruction of the Nazi leader's last days with a level of detail that was later considered coherent by Western researchers. During the first post-war years, the Soviet Union chose not to make the existence of the remains public. Instead, it promoted doubts about Hitler's death. Through official speeches and press reports, Soviet authorities insinuated that the German dictator might have escaped. This campaign of uncertainty extended for several years and fueled various hypotheses. Among them, the possibility that he had taken refuge in some remote place in the southern hemisphere. Already in the 1950s, the United States Central Intelligence Agency began receiving reports from witnesses who claimed to have seen Hitler in different South American countries. One of these documents, declassified in 2017, included the testimony of a man named Philippe Citron, who claimed to have conversed with Hitler in Colombia during 1955. He even provided a photograph where he supposedly appeared next to the dictator, although the analysts who reviewed the case discarded its veracity. The internal file indicated that neither the agent who received the material nor the sender had a way to verify what was related. In parallel, stories circulated about a secret Nazi base in Argentine Patagonia, a possible network of submarines, or even a connection with German facilities in Antarctica. None of these versions was supported by consistent evidence. Instead, the dental studies conducted in Moscow provided a firm basis to support the original account. In 1972, forensic expert R.F. Sonnes, together with Professor Michel Perrier, published a report confirming the authenticity of the dental pieces found in the bunker. The gold crowns, the maxillary configuration, and the wear marks matched Hitler's odontological history, documented by his personal dentist Hugo Blaschke. In 2018, a new forensic investigation led by French scientists directly examined the remains preserved by the FSB. Through microscopic and chemical analyses of the teeth and lower jaw, the researchers concluded that the fragments were authentic. They found no traces of gunpowder, which matched the version that Hitler shot himself while biting a poison capsule. In addition, comparisons with dental X-rays taken during his lifetime reinforced the identification. The report left no doubts about the dictator's death in his underground bunker in Berlin. Despite the forensic clarity, alternative theories persisted in certain sectors of popular culture. Some were promoted by television productions, such as the series Hunting Hitler, in which the former agent Bob Baer suggested that certain Argentine documents declassified in 2024 could contain clues about a possible escape. Baer mentioned connections between German scientists and the government of Juan Domingo Perón, including a nuclear project on Huemul Island. He also referred to a supposed support network that would have received help from local authorities. However, no document among those released to date directly links Hitler to those movements. In the archives consulted by the CIA, there are mentions of organized escapes through clandestine routes known as rat lines, which took thousands of Nazis to refuges in South America. Some cases were verified, such as those of Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele. But in all the reports, Hitler's name appears only speculatively or associated with unfounded rumors. The final report of the American forensic expert Charles Brandt, who analyzed Soviet documents and interviewed bunker witnesses, reaffirmed the official conclusion. Hitler died in Berlin on the 30th of April of 1945. His body was burned by direct order, and the remains were handled by Soviet forces. The stories about escapes were part of a narrative driven in part by Stalinist propaganda and later amplified by mass culture. To this day, no source has provided conclusive evidence that contradicts the forensic findings, eyewitness testimonies, or dental analyses. The escape hypothesis lacks serious documentary support and remains in the realm of fiction and speculation. The invincible technology of the Reich, more smoke than fire. In the final years of the war, the Nazi regime promoted a series of unconventional weapons under the label of Wunderwaffe, presented as advances capable of changing the course of the conflict. Among these projects were the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the Gustav gun, the Me-262 jet aircraft, glider bombs, and other experimental developments. Although they were real and at various stages of production, their impact was minimal due to technical failures, logistical obstacles, and unfeasible timelines. The V-2 missile, manufactured with great effort in the Mittelwerk underground facilities, was the first to cross the atmosphere and strike targets without possibility of defense. Despite that, each unit cost more than a 4-engine bomber, and its accuracy was very low. The factories required forced labor, and their production absorbed resources that other sectors needed urgently. In parallel, the Me-262, considered the first operational jet fighter aircraft, was introduced too late, in a context where Allied air dominance was already overwhelming. Its speed surpassed conventional fighters, but shortages of fuel, insufficient pilot training, and engine fragility limited its real utility. Hitler's government promoted these projects as symbols of a supposed scientific superiority capable of reversing the military situation, but in practice, their impact was limited. Reports from the Ministry of Armaments acknowledged that the launches of V-1 and V-2 had no decisive effects. Enemy aviation continued operating without interruption, supply lines remained cut, and cities continued exposed. The mass production of these weapons required strategic components that were scarce in the Reich, and technical delays or internal sabotage further hindered their effectiveness. The subsequent myth of unbeatable Nazi technology was reinforced through propaganda, photographs, and unpublished designs, but in reality, it was a desperate operation based on inflated expectations rather than concrete results. Some designs never progressed beyond the drawing board. Sonic guns, wire-guided projectiles, experimental saucers, and other unusual devices appear in official documents, but without conclusive proof of having reached a functional phase. Several of these programs were fueled by internal rumors, inflated promises from engineers, or simple Goebbels propaganda. In parallel, the German war machine could not match the production volume that the United States and the Soviet Union achieved daily. While the Reich manufactured a few jet aircraft per month, its enemies deployed thousands of bombers, tanks, and trucks. The charisma of Hitler, collective suggestion or feigned hypnotic power. The figure of Hitler, shown as an out-of-control character with overflowing shouts and extreme gestures, became popularized through cinema and more recently by the circulation of fragments on social networks. But that image does not correspond to the way he was perceived during his political career. Although in the last months of the regime his behavior became erratic, he did not always act in an unbalanced manner, nor does that aspect define how he managed to occupy positions of power. Reducing his trajectory to a case of madness or magical dominion over the public erases the social elements that enabled his rise. Hitler did not impose his figure by force from the beginning, nor did he come to government through a coup d'état. In January of 1933, he was appointed Chancellor by institutional decision after obtaining support from business circles, conservative politicians, and military sectors who saw him as a useful option against the communist threat. Between 1930 and 1933, he knew how to identify the moment of crisis, use it to his advantage, and appeal to the fears shared by broad sectors of German society. The backing he received was not fictitious nor imposed by force in its early stages. Various documentary sources show that, in his public presentations, he managed to generate a type of emotional connection with those who listened to him. He did not do so from reason or logical argument, but through a staging that appealed to anxiety, insecurity, and the desire for order. This collective effect did not imply mental control or supernatural abilities. It was the result of a relationship between his discourse, the psychological disposition of the public, and the emotional context of the country. Fridolin von Spaun recounted that in an informal encounter he perceived an intense gaze from Hitler, to which he attributed a supposed extraordinary force of will, although it was possibly just a tremor. For his part, Emil Klein remembered that in a brewery, the atmosphere created an automatic acceptance among the attendees, more influenced by collective tension than by the content of the speech. These reactions do not reveal a personal hypnotic power, but a carefully designed environment to provoke a shared emotion. Subsequent investigations indicate that the supposed magnetism of the leader did not arise from him in isolation, but from the collective bond generated in mass events. That emotional tie was strengthened through a carefully planned network of media. From 1933, the Ministry of Propaganda, directed by Joseph Goebbels, used radio, cinema, posters and parades to consolidate an image of incontestable leadership. It was not just about reproducing speeches, but about fabricating a carefully edited representation of the head of state. In documentary films, such as those directed by Leni Riefenstahl, a staging was constructed that showed Hitler as a conductor of multitudes. The framing, music and editing collaborated in creating a figure that seemed to connect emotionally with the German people in a spontaneous way. In reality, those materials were produced with precise technical logic, in which every shot, sound and word responded to a strategy of symbolic construction. The speeches were recorded and repeated on loudspeakers placed in streets, stations and factories. Official photographs were retouched and distributed massively. Newspaper covers constantly showed his face. The state radio broadcast messages with his voice at key times. All that structure amplified his presence, even in places where he had never been in person. That omnipresence was not the product of an individual quality, but of a systematic campaign executed from the regime's institutions. In public events, the script for entry, gestures, and the exact moment when he should speak were decided in advance. The use of symbols, uniforms, lighting, and collective choreographies did not respond to chance or spontaneous charisma, but to a design intended to generate a mass emotional experience. The impression of being before an uncommon leader was provoked by the sum of those elements, not by an innate quality. Therefore, the effect that many witnesses recounted cannot be understood as a direct consequence of a mysterious personal power, but as the result of an environment prepared to produce that type of reaction. The sensation of enthusiasm, identification, or devotion was built through a system that combined repetition, staging, and emotional appeal. Hitler did not provoke those responses by inexplicable means, but because he represented with gestures and words the shared anxieties of a population struck by defeat, inflation, and unemployment. The supposed charisma was then the product of an interaction between discourse, propaganda technique, and political environment. His public figure was not the result of hypnotic influence, but of a sustained strategy that transformed a politician into a symbol of redemption for millions. Far from being an inexplicable exception, it was an extreme case of media construction based on precise historical conditions and communication technologies that multiplied and reinforced his image as a savior leader. All these accounts formed a narrative designed to hide failures, disguise crimes, and reinforce the regime's power. Behind each myth there were documents, decisions, and strategies that built a false but effective story. Understanding how they worked is not just a matter of memory, but of dismantling the lies that still persist.